What we learned today is devastating for the BBC's reputation at home and abroad. A leaked internal memo seen by the Daily Telegraph reveals that the corporation doctored a speech by President Donald Trump to make him appear to encourage the Capitol Hill riots.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and I'll be there with you, and we fight. We fight like hell. We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women.
According to the whistleblower, the Panorama programme edited together separate parts of Trump's words, added foreboding music and juxtaposed them with footage of the Capitol riots that were shot before the speech had even been made. The aim was to create the false impression that he had exhorted his supporters to take violent action. This is shameful. It's worse than any other editorial legerdemain that we have seen in the past. Far worse than the Martin Bashir interview of Diana, Princess of Wales. The then princess may have been misled, but she wanted to do the interview anyway. Donald Trump has words attributed to him that he simply did not say, and it's a fraud. The BBC, which is funded by you, the public, via tax, presented manipulated footage as a fact to back its own left-wing agenda. For decades, many of us have suspected the BBC of bias, whether over Brexit, Gaza, green policies or cultural affairs, and this is further confirmation of that suspicion. Not only was President Trump misrepresented, but the dossier also flags bias in the coverage of Gaza by the Arabic Service, censorship of transgender debates, and dismissals of complaints raised by the corporation's own standards watchdog. Senior executives, including the Director General Tim Davie and the Chairman Samir Shah, were alerted, but of course, reportedly, they turned a blind eye. Complaints from the Standards Committee were apparently dismissed. Warnings about dangerous editorial behaviour were seemingly ignored. Internationally, this is catastrophic for the BBC's reputation. It shatters it. Foreign governments can no longer be expected to trust the BBC, must damage the standing of the World Service after it has deliberately misrepresented one of the main world leaders. How can the public now be expected to pay a licence fee to fund an organisation that does not uphold impartiality, that lies to its audience to support its own lefty worldview, and that refuses to hold its executives accountable? This scandal should encourage the government to scrap the ridiculous licence fee once and for all. No taxpayer should be obliged to fund a broadcaster that is a front for political activism. This is more than an isolated case of bias. It's malpractice, deception, fraud and cover-up, a stain on the BBC's escutcheon and, by extension, on that of Britain. As always, let me know what you think. mailmog@gbnews.com.
We're living in a time of what feels like pretty significant social change, and it makes us question things that we've even taken for granted for decades. And one of those at the moment that people are wondering about is actually money. Is the money in your bank account safe? Should you be investing elsewhere? Are we looking at a potential global crash? What will it mean for your savings? Is there a way that you could be using your money that might be outside of government control even? Well, TallyMoney is potentially one solution. So I'm delighted to say that I'm joined today by the CEO and founder of TallyMoney, Cameron Parry. What is TallyMoney?
Well, at TallyMoney, you basically get gold you can spend. So we give people an individual account in their name, everyday account. They get a sort code and account number. They use that account just like they would pounds from their bank, but it's milligrams of gold that we brand as Tally.
Okay. Why would you do that, though? What is the benefit to the customer instead of just having a normal pound sterling account?
Gold's performance against the pound is above 11% per annum over the last 25 years on average. But we still need money in our daily lives, and we have savings. We know that it's good common sense and prudent to save up for things, not just live in credit. You know, whether it's a holiday or a rainy day, your retirement planning, you need to have money in your life, basically, that you can rely on, that's dependable, that nobody meddles with, that nobody can weaponise against you, which is another element of government control when it's the government currency, which we could talk about another time. And it should be pretty simple and straightforward, and that's what we deliver at Tally. And really, we just want people to feel safe and happy with their money. There was a time when the bigger your bank balance, the more confident you felt. Now it's like, I need to do something with it. I can't leave it there. In Tally, you can.
OK, brilliant. Cameron Parry from TallyMoney, thank you so much.
Thank you, Bev.
I'm joined now by the former BBC journalist Tom Bauer and my most intellectual panel, Sir John Redwood and Stephen Pound. Tom, let me come to you first, because this is really extraordinary, isn't it, that the BBC Panorama flagship BBC programme has essentially committed fraud to do down the now President of the United States just before the election.
Well, it's much worse than that. Now I'm, of course, a former Panorama producer and reporter for 10 years. What is really awful and what the most revealing part of this report is that it was commissioned internally. These aren't outside critics, right-wing critics, left-wing critics. This is an internal report written by a man called Michael Prescott, who was absolutely outraged that what he discovered when he discovered the distortion, the deliberate distortion of Trump's speech, his warnings and his report was ignored. Not only by the head of news, Deborah Turness, and her deputy, Jonathan Munro, but also by the chairman of the BBC, Samir Shah, and the Director General. All of them refused to take any action. So what you're really dealing with, and I say this with great sadness, is a shocking rottenness, a corruption at the top of the BBC. There's clearly a sentiment. We're not going to rely on the truth. We're going to cover up dishonesty. We're going to peddle dishonesty, and we hope to get away with it.
But this is a continuation of their approach of covering things up, as they did with Martin Bashir, as they did with Jimmy Savile, as they did with Hugh Edwards. It just constantly covers up things that it gets wrong.
Well, I mean, it's not only the cover-up. I mean, obviously, on the Bashir Diana, the cover-up went on for over 20 years. And even when it was investigated by a judge, the cover-up continued of the cover-up. I mean, it's still, after all, they've redacted hundreds of documents so you don't discover the truth. What is appalling in this case is that the cover-up is so blatant that the internal investigator and reporter, Prescott, actually announces there has been dishonesty, and the chairman and the director of the BBC deliberately ignore his report. And it only comes to us because he distributed it amongst the board of directors, and one of them clearly leaked it to the Telegraph. If it hadn't been for the leak, we wouldn't know. And, of course, this comes after 2 years of the most appalling biased reporting from Gaza, where we can go on to that, but I mean, it's dreadful complaints about that.
Because they had a similar problem with Gaza, where they actually basically just put the Hamas case and didn't admit it.
Well, not only put the Hamas case, but people like Fergal Keane, a reporter in Jerusalem, would use Hamas-supplied material, splice it together with the wailing woman and the dead bodies and all the rest of it, and pretend in his reporting that he was actually in Gaza and had checked the story. He would pronounce constantly 15 dead, 20 dead, and he had no idea how many dead there were, how many living, or who the dead were, because he was in Jerusalem, relying on Hamas-supplied material. And the shocking thing about that whole Gaza reporting was that Deborah Turness and Jonathan Munro and Tim Davie and all of them stood by and allowed Hamas to peddle their propaganda through the BBC every day on our state broadcaster.
Stephen, let me come to you. How do you think the BBC recovers from this? Because this is very serious.
I couldn't disagree with you more. I'm not going to die in a ditch for the BBC. Certainly not going to do that. But I think I simply cannot understand what you're talking about here. Look, Donald Trump said those things. Now, if they were put out in a different order, so be it. He still said those things.
He didn't.
But there's one fact that we cannot dispute. The day after he was elected as president, he pardoned 1,400 people who had brought death and destruction onto their parliament building, the Senate, and actually caused mayhem on that. He pardoned them and he called them hostages.
Yes,
he was complicit and supportive of those people.
This was before the election, so before anyone was pardoned. And the BBC made it look as if he'd encouraged those riots when actually the march was already underway, and he clearly didn't. His phrasing makes it clear that he didn't.
Why, Jacob, would the BBC do that? The electors of America don't listen to the BBC.
But why would the BBC do that? Because the BBC has never liked Donald Trump. The BBC
didn't. The BBC isn't a single individual.
It didn't like Brexit, it didn't like Donald Trump, and it plays its tune according to political
At the risk
views.
of being offensive, you cannot project your own prejudices onto a vast organisation.
Well, I think it's what the BBC does to the rest of us. John, let me bring you in.
Well, of course it does. I think you're absolutely right, Jacob, that this is a disaster for the BBC. It prides itself in being independent and accurate reporting and fact checks everybody it doesn't like, but nobody fact checks the BBC. And we then have an internal report saying that this was incorrectly spliced and misrepresented the man who's now the President of the United States. And we don't get an automatic apology and a confession that this has gone wrong. And as you rightly say, there's been all sorts of malpractice and bad people at the BBC without proper apologies. I'm very worried because the BBC is now tiny compared with the 7 American media giants. And those media giants are now supplying things that people want to pay for in the United Kingdom, out-competing the BBC when people have to pay twice. They have to pay compulsorily for the BBC they don't want to watch, and they have to pay for what they do want to watch. And the BBC doesn't seem to care about that. It doesn't realise how uncompetitive it is and what a disaster it is for the British media industry.
And Stephen, aren't people going to find they're not going to pay the licence fee to a broadcast that's so biased?
Well, I think this is a different issue. We can argue about the validity and the legitimacy of the licence fee, and I tend to actually agree with you on that. I think it should be voluntary. As it is in America, you can choose to actually subscribe to public broadcasting in America, and you can choose not to. It's entirely your choice. But look, the BBC is actually a very commercial organisation. It makes a lot of money. We talk about the Martin Bashir one. That wasn't actually a BBC production. That was a company for the BBC. And Martin Bashir, the man who faked bank accounts to actually get that interview, was actually not somebody directly employed there. But they do make money out of it. So the question is the BBC worth the licence fee? At the moment, I'd say probably isn't.
And how do you defend the Director General and the Chairman not acting on this report, not doing anything about it?
I must admit, I'm not privy to the internal workings of the BBC. There are at least one person who knows much more about this than I will ever know about this. I've only seen the headlines in the Telegraph. I haven't read tomorrow's Telegraph because today isn't tomorrow.
But there should be an automatic apology, isn't it?
But it's got to be investigated first.
It's
been investigated.
It's been investigated, exactly.
They're suppressing a report from their own people.
Exactly.
Not their critics making this up. This is them.
Yeah. I think
and they've got a few honest people there who say that this is wrong, and they try and bury it.
The BBC motto surely is always deputy heads must roll.
In this case, it's the real head which must roll. I mean, Tim Davie has really got to lose his job because he has overseen this cover-up.
Well, there we go. And one wonders what the titans at Ofcom are going to do about this. When
they're too busy watching us.
I think that's right. Well, we're much more interesting, so that's why they watch GBNews.
More people are watching.
Anyway, we're very lucky because we've got a spokesman from the BBC saying this. While we don't comment on leaked documents, when the BBC receives feedback, it takes it seriously and considers it carefully. Michael Prescott is a former advisor to a board committee where differing views and opinions of our coverage are routinely discussed and debated. Well, I don't know what the Today programme would do if they never discussed leaked documents, but never mind.